Early America and colonization. Long before European settlers arrived, the continent we now call America was home to diverse Native American civilizations. Tribes such as the Iroquois, Cherokee, Sioux, and Pueblo developed complex societies with distinct languages, customs, and governance systems. Many relied on farming maize, beans, and squash, while others hunted, fished, or traded goods over vast networks stretching across North America. The story of European colonization began in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, sailing under Spain, reached the Caribbean, opening the Americas to European exploration. Other explorers followed. John Cabot claimed parts of Canada for England in 1497, while Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro conquered powerful empires in Central and South America. The first permanent English settlement in North America was Jamestown, Virginia, 1607. Sponsored by the Virginia Company, settlers faced disease, starvation, and conflict with local Native Americans. Despite these hardships, they survived through trade, agriculture, and, later, the cultivation of tobacco, which became Virginia's main cash crop. In 1620, the Pilgrims sailed on the Mayflower to establish Plymouth Colony in present-day Massachusetts. Seeking religious freedom, they negotiated the Mayflower Compact, a pioneering document establishing self-governance and cooperation among settlers. Over time, other colonies emerged along the Atlantic coast, each with unique characteristics. Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New Hampshire were largely founded by Puritans seeking religious refuge. Maryland became a haven for Catholics, while Pennsylvania, founded by William Penn, promoted religious tolerance and fair treatment of Native Americans. Colonial life was diverse and often difficult. Settlers built homes from wood, farmed small plots of land, and traded goods locally or across the Atlantic. Native American communities sometimes cooperated with settlers, trading furs and food, but conflicts over land and resources frequently erupted, leading to violent clashes. By the mid-1600s, European powers, including England, France, Spain, and the Netherlands, competed fiercely for control of North America. This competition shaped the cultural, economic, and political development of the colonies. Trade networks expanded, involving goods like tobacco, sugar, and furs, while enslaved Africans were brought to work on plantations, laying the foundation for a system of slavery that would later dominate the Southern economy. Early America was therefore a land of opportunity and struggle, where European ambition, Native American resilience, and African labor intertwined. These complex beginnings set the stage for the social, cultural, and political forces that would eventually drive the colonies toward independence. The Age of Exploration, 1492 to 1607. The Age of Exploration was a pivotal era that reshaped the world politically, economically, and culturally. By the late 15th century, Europe was driven by a desire for wealth, new trade routes, religious influence, and territorial expansion. Nations like Spain, Portugal, England, and France were competing fiercely to dominate global commerce and claim new lands. Technological innovations, including the astrolabe, magnetic compass, sextant, and sturdy ships like caravels and carracks, enabled explorers to navigate oceans that had once been impassable. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, sailing under the Spanish crown of Ferdinand and Isabella, set out westward to find a route to Asia. Instead, he arrived in the Caribbean, encountering the Taino and Arawak peoples, whose complex societies relied on farming, fishing, and trade. These early encounters introduced Europeans to unfamiliar crops such as maize, cassava, and cacao, but also led to devastating consequences. Disease, enslavement, and violence decimated indigenous populations. Other explorers followed, including John Cabot, who reached the coast of present-day Canada in 1497 for England, and Amerigo Vespucci, whose voyages helped demonstrate that the New World was a previously unknown continent. The lands Columbus and others explored were rich in natural resources, including gold, silver, and fertile soil, fueling further European expeditions. In Central and South America, Spanish conquistadors pursued conquest and wealth. Hernán Cortés led an expedition that toppled the Aztec Empire, 1519 to 1521, capturing the powerful city of Tenochtitlan, while Francisco Pizarro conquered the Inca Empire, 1532–1533, in the Andes. These campaigns involved alliances with some indigenous groups, advanced military technology like firearms and steel weapons, and catastrophic spread of European diseases. Meanwhile, the Columbian Exchange reshaped the world's ecosystems, economies, and diets. European explorers and settlers brought horses, cattle, wheat, and sugar to the Americas, while returning to Europe with maize, potatoes, tomatoes, cacao, and tobacco. This exchange transformed agriculture, nutrition, and trade globally, laying the foundation for an interconnected Atlantic world. In North America, England's first sustained colonization attempt occurred in the early 1600s. Jamestown, Virginia, 1607, established by the Virginia Company, faced extreme hardship. Settlers contended with disease, hunger, and tense relations with local Powhatan tribes. Survival required adaptation, building fortified homes, cultivating tobacco as a cash crop, and developing local alliances. These early settlements established patterns of European colonization that would expand rapidly in the coming decades. By 1607, European exploration had mapped large parts of the eastern seaboard, established early colonies, and created networks of trade and cultural exchange. This era combined adventure, scientific discovery, conquest, and exploitation, profoundly altering the lives of native peoples, Europeans, and the world at large. The Age of Exploration set the stage for the creation of the American colonies, a new Atlantic economy, and centuries of global interaction. The Colonies, 1607–1770s. The story of the American colonies begins in 1607 with Jamestown, Virginia, the first permanent English settlement in North America. Established by the Virginia Company, Jamestown was founded with the goal of discovering wealth and establishing a foothold for England in the New World. The early settlers faced extreme hardship, disease, contaminated water, harsh winters, and scarce food created a struggle for survival. Relations with the Powhatan Confederacy were tense and complicated, sometimes cooperative, sometimes violent. These interactions shaped the colony's early survival. Jamestown's fortunes changed with the introduction of tobacco cultivation by John Rolfe, which became the colony's main economic engine. Tobacco exports brought wealth and attracted more settlers, but the labor-intensive crop required a large workforce. In 1619, the first enslaved Africans arrived in Jamestown, beginning a system of chattel slavery that would become central to the Southern economy for generations. Enslaved Africans provided the labor for plantations, fundamentally shaping social hierarchies and the economy in the Southern colonies. Meanwhile, in 1620, another group of English settlers, the Pilgrims, sailed on the Mayflower seeking religious freedom. They established Plymouth Colony in present-day Massachusetts. The Pilgrims endured freezing winters, disease, and famine. Survival required adaptation to a new land, and with the guidance of Native Americans like Squanto, they learned to plant corn, fish, and hunt local game. In 1621, the Pilgrims celebrated a successful harvest with a feast alongside Native allies, giving rise to what is now remembered as Thanksgiving, a symbol of cooperation, gratitude, and resilience in the face of adversity. The Pilgrims also signed the Mayflower Compact, an early example of self-governance based on majority consent, establishing principles that would echo in future American political thought. Shortly thereafter, Puritans settled much of Massachusetts Bay, seeking to create a city upon a hill, a society strictly governed by their religious beliefs. Puritan communities emphasized moral discipline, education, literacy, and civic responsibility. Schools were established to teach children to read the Bible, and church attendance was mandatory. However, strict adherence to religious norms sometimes led to fear and suspicion, as seen in the Salem witch trials, 1692–1693. Hysteria, fueled by social tension, religious fervor, and economic rivalries, resulted in the execution of 20 people and imprisonment of many others, highlighting the dangers of extremism in tightly controlled communities. Life across the colonies varied greatly depending on geography and economy. In the northern colonies, small farms, fishing villages, and towns formed the backbone of society. Settlers practiced subsistence farming, engaged in artisanal trades, and developed local markets. Communities emphasized education and civic participation through town meetings, giving residents a voice in governance. Northern ports facilitated trade with Europe and the Caribbean, creating a growing merchant class. In the southern colonies, the economy was dominated by large plantations producing tobacco, rice, and indigo. These plantations relied heavily on enslaved African labor, which created stark social hierarchies and entrenched racial divisions. Wealthy planters controlled politics, trade, and society, while enslaved people endured brutal labor and harsh living conditions. Plantations were often self-sufficient communities, with farmland, workshops, and housing for enslaved workers, producing the wealth that would fuel the Southern economy for decades. Throughout all regions, Native American populations faced displacement, warfare, and cultural disruption. Colonists encroached on ancestral lands, and European diseases caused devastating epidemics among indigenous communities. Some tribes resisted colonization through armed conflict, while others adapted by engaging in trade or forming alliances with settlers. By the mid-18th century, the colonies had developed distinct social, political, and economic identities, blending European traditions with local adaptations. Towns and farms flourished, trade networks expanded, and early forms of self-government and civic responsibility were practiced. Yet tensions with Native Americans, economic disparities, and emerging cultural differences foreshadowed the conflicts and revolutionary ideas that would define the next chapter of American history. The period from 1607 to the 1770s was one of survival, adaptation, and growth. Jamestown taught settlers the harsh realities of New World life. Plymouth demonstrated the power of cooperation and faith. Puritan communities showed both the strength and dangers of religious devotion, and the northern and southern economies laid the foundation for an increasingly complex society. Together, these colonies formed a patchwork of communities whose experiences, struggles, and triumphs set the stage for the birth of a new nation. The Road to Revolution, 1763 to 1775. The conclusion of the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, left Britain victorious but deeply in debt. To recover financially and maintain its vast North American empire, Britain imposed new taxes on the American colonies, setting the stage for a confrontation that would alter the course of history. The Sugar Act, 1764, and the Stamp Act, 1765, were among the first measures that inflamed colonial resentment. The Stamp Act required colonists to purchase special stamped paper for legal documents, newspapers, and other printed materials. Many viewed this as taxation without representation, arguing that only their colonial assemblies had the right to levy taxes. Protests erupted in towns and cities, leading to boycotts of British goods, the formation of Sons of Liberty groups, and public demonstrations, some of which turned violent. Tensions escalated with the Townshend Acts, 1767, which placed duties on imported goods such as glass, paint, paper, and tea. Colonists organized widespread non-importation agreements, refusing to buy taxed goods, and local artisans and merchants joined in resistance. In 1770, the Boston Massacre became a flashpoint when British soldiers fired on a crowd of protesters, killing 5 colonists and further inflaming anti-British sentiment. Propaganda and vivid illustrations of the event spread rapidly, fueling outrage and uniting colonists in their opposition to British authority. In 1773, the Tea Act allowed the struggling British East India Company to sell tea directly to the colonies at a reduced tax, undercutting local merchants. In response, patriots in Boston staged the dramatic Boston Tea Party, dumping 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. This act of defiance prompted harsh retaliation from Britain, including the Intolerable Acts, which closed Boston's port, restricted town meetings, and expanded the powers of colonial governors. In the midst of growing unrest, colonies began forming militias to defend their communities. Groups of volunteer soldiers, known as Minutemen, trained to respond rapidly to threats. These citizen soldiers, often farmers, tradesmen, and ordinary townspeople, prepared for the possibility of armed conflict, marking the transition from protest to revolution. Colonists debated not only the legality of British actions but also the fundamental rights of free people. Pamphlets, newspapers, and public debates spread ideas about natural rights, liberty, and self-governance. Leaders like Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, and John Hancock emerged, articulating the growing desire for independence. By 1775, tensions had reached a breaking point. British attempts to seize colonial arms and powder stores led to clashes at Lexington and Concord, where the first shots of the American Revolution were fired. The colonies were no longer simply protesting taxes, they were preparing to fight for their freedom, setting the stage for a full-scale war that would transform their society and birth a new nation. The road to revolution was thus a story of escalating conflict, political organization, grassroots resistance, and the emergence of a shared colonial identity. Ordinary citizens, from merchants to farmers to artisans, began to see themselves as part of a larger struggle for rights and self-determination, laying the foundation for the United States' fight for independence. The Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1783. The American Revolutionary War, fought between 1775 and 1783, was a profound struggle for independence that involved not only battles on American soil but also diplomacy, ideology, and global alliances. The first spark of conflict came at Lexington and Concord in April 1775. British troops were sent to seize colonial arms and ammunition stockpiles, but local Minutemen militias, farmers, and townspeople resisted. The brief skirmishes left casualties on both sides and marked the shot heard round the world, signaling that the colonies were willing to fight for their rights. Soon after, the Battle of Bunker Hill, June 1775, demonstrated both colonial resolve and British vulnerability. Though technically a British victory, the colonists inflicted heavy casualties, proving that citizen soldiers could challenge the most disciplined army of the era. Inspired by such resistance, the Second Continental Congress formed the Continental Army and appointed George Washington as commander-in-chief. Washington faced tremendous challenges: limited resources, inexperienced soldiers, harsh winter conditions, and the difficulty of uniting 13 diverse colonies under a single command. The conflict escalated into a full-scale war across multiple fronts. In 1777, the Battle of Saratoga became a turning point. American forces, using strategic positioning, intelligence, and guerrilla tactics, decisively defeated British General John Burgoyne's army. This victory was pivotal in convincing France to formally ally with the colonies. French troops, naval forces, and financial aid expanded the revolution into an international struggle. Spain and the Netherlands also indirectly supported the American cause, stretching British resources then across multiple continents. Amidst the military struggle, revolutionary ideas were codified. On July 4, 1776, the Declaration of Independence, drafted primarily by Thomas Jefferson with input from John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and others, formally proclaimed the colonies as free and independent states. The document articulated the revolutionary ideals of natural rights, equality, and self-determination, asserting that governments derive power from the consent of the governed and that citizens have the right to overthrow oppressive rulers. The war tested both armies and civilians. Colonists engaged in conventional battles, guerrilla warfare, and strategic sieges. Civilians provided crucial support by supplying food, clothing, and intelligence. Women, such as Molly Pitcher, aided soldiers on battlefields, carrying water, nursing the wounded, and even manning cannons during combat. African Americans and Native Americans also played roles, often choosing sides based on promises of freedom, protection, or political alliances. The final major confrontation occurred at Yorktown in 1781, where combined American and French forces, including a powerful French naval blockade, trapped British General Charles Cornwallis. Surrounded and outnumbered, Cornwallis surrendered, effectively ending major combat operations and signaling the colony's victory. The Treaty of Paris, 1783, formally recognized the United States as a sovereign nation. The treaty established boundaries stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River, granted fishing rights in the North Atlantic, and resolved financial claims between Britain and the United States. The Revolutionary War was more than a military victory, it was a triumph of ideals, courage, and perseverance. Ordinary colonists, allied with international partners and inspired by principles of liberty, had successfully challenged the most powerful empire in the world and created a new nation founded on the principles of self-governance, equality, and freedom. The American Revolution remains a testament to the power of ideas and collective action, illustrating that a determined population, united by a vision of liberty, could alter the course of history and inspire generations to come. The Road to Revolution, 1763 to 1775. The conclusion of the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, left Britain victorious but deeply in debt. To recover financially and maintain its vast North American empire, Britain imposed new taxes on the American colonies, setting the stage for a confrontation that would alter the course of history. The Sugar Act, 1764, and the Stamp Act, 1765, were among the first measures that inflamed colonial resentment. The Stamp Act required colonists to purchase special stamped paper for legal documents, newspapers, and other printed materials. Many viewed this as taxation without representation, arguing that only their colonial assemblies had the right to levy taxes. Protests erupted in towns and cities, leading to boycotts of British goods, the formation of Sons of Liberty groups, and public demonstrations, some of which turned violent. Tensions escalated with the Townshend Acts, 1767, which placed duties on imported goods such as glass, paint, paper, and tea. Colonists organized widespread non-importation agreements, refusing to buy taxed goods, and local artisans and merchants joined in resistance. In 1770, the Boston Massacre became a flashpoint when British soldiers fired on a crowd of protesters, killing 5 colonists and further inflaming anti-British sentiment. Propaganda and vivid illustrations of the event spread rapidly, fueling outrage and uniting colonists in their opposition to British authority. In 1773, the Tea Act allowed the struggling British East India Company to sell tea directly to the colonies at a reduced tax, undercutting local merchants. In response, patriots in Boston staged the dramatic Boston Tea Party, dumping 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. This act of defiance prompted harsh retaliation from Britain, including the Intolerable Acts, which closed Boston's port, restricted town meetings, and expanded the powers of colonial governors. In the midst of growing unrest, colonies began forming militias to defend their communities. Groups of volunteer soldiers, known as Minutemen, trained to respond rapidly to threats. These citizen soldiers, often farmers, tradesmen, and ordinary townspeople, prepared for the possibility of armed conflict, marking the transition from protest to revolution. Colonists debated not only the legality of British actions but also the fundamental rights of free people. Pamphlets, newspapers, and public debates spread ideas about natural rights, liberty, and self-governance. Leaders like Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, and John Hancock emerged, articulating the growing desire for independence. By 1775, tensions had reached a breaking point. British attempts to seize colonial arms and powder stores led to clashes at Lexington and Concord, where the first shots of the American Revolution were fired. The colonies were no longer simply protesting taxes, they were preparing to fight for their freedom, setting the stage for a full-scale war that would transform their society and birth a new nation. The road to revolution was thus a story of escalating conflict, political organization, grassroots resistance, and the emergence of a shared colonial identity. Ordinary citizens, from merchants to farmers to artisans, began to see themselves as part of a larger struggle for rights and self-determination, laying the foundation for the United States' fight for independence. Westward expansion, 1820s, 1850s. The decades from the 1820s to the 1850s were a period of unprecedented growth, migration, and conflict in the United States. The driving ideology of manifest destiny, the belief that Americans were divinely destined to expand across the North American continent, shaped the ambitions, policies, and daily lives of settlers. It inspired pioneers to move westward in search of land, opportunity, and a new life, transforming the nation both geographically and culturally. Westward migration brought enormous challenges. Settlers traveled on rough, often dangerous trails in wagons pulled by oxen or horses, facing harsh weather, treacherous terrain, disease, and shortages of food and water. Communities sprang up along rivers and fertile valleys, establishing farms, towns, and trading posts. The promise of land ownership and economic opportunity attracted immigrants from Europe, including Germans, Irish, and Scandinavians, while also fueling the displacement of Native Americans. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, championed by President Andrew Jackson, authorized the federal government to forcibly relocate Native American tribes from the southeast to lands west of the Mississippi. The Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole nations were uprooted from their ancestral homelands, often after decades of adaptation to European American practices. The infamous Trail of Tears saw thousands of Cherokee men, women, and children forced to march over 1,000 miles to present-day Oklahoma. Exposure to cold, hunger, disease, and exhaustion led to the deaths of thousands, marking one of the darkest chapters in the nation's westward expansion. Economic opportunity also spurred migration. In 1848 to 1849, gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill in California, igniting the California Gold Rush. Tens of thousands of 49ers poured into California from the eastern United States, Latin America, Europe, and Asia. Boomtowns such as San Francisco grew overnight, with makeshift businesses, saloons, and mining camps springing up to accommodate the influx. The gold rush brought immense wealth for some but also extreme hardship, environmental degradation, and violent clashes with Native Americans and competing miners. The population surge accelerated California's admission as a state in 1850. Territorial expansion also brought political and military conflict. In 1836, Texas declared independence from Mexico after tensions between Anglo settlers and the Mexican government over issues like slavery, taxes, and governance erupted into armed conflict. Following the Battle of the Alamo and other key engagements, Texas achieved independence and later saw annexation by the United States in 1845. This move angered Mexico, which considered Texas part of its territory, leading to the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848. American forces, led by generals such as Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott, launched campaigns across northern Mexico, securing victories in battles like Buena Vista and capturing Mexico City. The war ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ceded vast territories, including California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming, to the United States. This acquisition fulfilled much of the vision of Manifest Destiny but intensified national debates over the expansion of slavery. The debate over slavery became increasingly urgent as new territories were added. Northern states, where slavery was largely abolished, opposed the extension of the institution into the West, while southern states sought to protect and expand it. Laws like the Missouri Compromise, 1820, attempted to maintain a balance between free and slave states, but each new territory raised contentious questions. Politicians, abolitionists, and settlers debated the morality, legality, and economic implications of slavery, planting the seeds of sectional conflict that would eventually culminate in the Civil War. Westward expansion during this era was thus a complex mixture of ambition, opportunity, suffering, and conflict. It reshaped the geography of the United States, altered the lives of Native Americans, brought immense wealth and migration to California, and provoked debates that challenged the nation's moral and political foundations. By the mid-19th century, the United States had grown dramatically in size and population, yet the successes of expansion were inseparable from the profound human costs and deepening sectional tensions that would shape the coming decades. Civil War and Reconstruction, 1861 to 1877. The American Civil War, fought from 1861 to 1865, was the most devastating conflict in the nation's history, rooted in deep economic, social, and political divisions. The Southern states, whose economies relied heavily on slavery and plantation agriculture, championed states' rights and resisted federal interference. The Northern states, increasingly industrialized and politically opposed to the expansion of slavery, prioritized preserving the Union and, over time, abolishing human bondage. Sectional differences, over tariffs, culture, and political power, intensified tensions, ultimately threatening the survival of the United States as a unified nation. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 sparked immediate crisis. Lincoln, representing the anti-slavery Republican Party, was perceived by Southern leaders as a threat to their way of life. Following his victory, South Carolina and other Southern states seceded, forming the Confederate States of America, led by Jefferson Davis. Secession set the stage for war as the Union sought to preserve national unity, while the Confederacy fought to defend its sovereignty and the institution of slavery. The war began in April 1861, when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. Over the next 4 years, bloody battles engulfed the nation. At Antietam, 1862, the bloodiest single-day battle in American history, over 22,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. The Battle of Gettysburg, 1863, marked a turning point. Union forces under General George Meade repelled General Robert E. Lee's invasion of the North, halting Confederate momentum and setting the stage for eventual Union victory. In the midst of war, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, 1863, declaring all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory to be free. Though it did not immediately free all enslaved individuals, it redefined the purpose of the war, making the fight not just about preserving the Union but also about ending slavery. African Americans enlisted in the Union Army and Navy, contributing significantly to the war effort and asserting their claim to citizenship and freedom. By 1865, the Confederacy had been defeated. Union forces captured key Southern cities, and General Lee surrendered to General Ulysses South Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The war resulted in immense human cost. Over 600,000 soldiers died, millions were wounded, and vast portions of the Southern economy and infrastructure lay in ruins. In the aftermath, the Reconstruction era, 1865 to 1877, sought to rebuild the South and integrate formerly enslaved people into American society. The 13th Amendment, 1865, abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment, 1868, guaranteed equal protection under the law, and the 15th Amendment, 1870, granted African American men the right to vote. Reconstruction governments made significant strides, establishing schools, expanding political participation, and promoting civil rights. However, progress was met with violent resistance. White supremacist groups such as the Ku Klux Klan terrorized black communities, using intimidation, violence, and voter suppression to restore white dominance. The Compromise of 1877, which resolved the disputed 1876 presidential election, effectively ended Reconstruction, leaving the South under segregationist control and African Americans vulnerable to systemic racism and disenfranchisement for decades to come. The Civil War and Reconstruction were thus both a tragedy and a triumph. The nation endured a catastrophic conflict to preserve the Union and abolish slavery, laying the legal groundwork for civil rights. Yet the promise of equality was undermined by social resistance and entrenched racism, highlighting the ongoing struggle for justice and inclusion in American society. The Gilded Age and Immigration, 1877-1900s. The period following Reconstruction, from 1877 into the early 1900s, became known as the Gilded Age, a term coined by Mark Twain to describe a nation glittering with wealth but marred by corruption, inequality, and social tension. It was an era of rapid industrialization, technological innovation, urban growth, and massive immigration, reshaping American society in profound ways. The United States experienced explosive industrial growth. Entrepreneurs like Andrew Carnegie revolutionized the steel industry, producing rails, bridges, and skyscrapers that fueled urban expansion. John D. Rockefeller built a near monopoly in oil through Standard Oil, exemplifying the rise of powerful industrial magnates, often called robber barons for their ruthless business tactics. The expansion of railroads connected the country coast to coast, facilitating trade, migration, and settlement while transforming the landscape and economy. Railroads also accelerated the rise of industries such as coal, steel, and timber, creating jobs but also environmental destruction and harsh working conditions. Technological innovation transformed daily life. Electricity powered factories and homes, while telephones revolutionized communication. Automobiles, still in their early stages, began to change transportation and commerce. These inventions increased productivity, spurred urbanization, and shaped a modernizing society, yet they also created profound social challenges, including overcrowded cities, unsafe working conditions, and poor sanitation. During this period, immigration surged, with millions arriving through Ellis Island in New York Harbor and other ports. Immigrants came from Southern and Eastern Europe, including Italians, Poles, Russians, and Jews fleeing persecution, as well as Chinese and Japanese laborers on the West Coast. They provided the labor that fueled factories, mines, and railroads, yet they faced discrimination, poverty, and dangerous working conditions. Ethnic neighborhoods, cultural traditions, and new institutions emerged, transforming the social and cultural landscape of American cities. Laborers, including men, women, and even children, worked long hours in factories, mines, and mills under dangerous conditions for minimal pay. Tragic events, such as the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire, 1911, though slightly after the Gilded Age, highlighted the risks industrial workers faced. In response, labor unions began to organize, fighting for better wages, shorter hours, safer workplaces, and the right to collectively bargain. Groups such as the Knights of Labor and the American Federation of Labor, AFL, became prominent, staging strikes and protests that often met with violent resistance from factory owners and sometimes government forces. Politics during the Gilded Age were marked by corruption and machine politics. Political bosses, like Boss Tweed of Tammany Hall in New York City, controlled votes, government contracts, and municipal resources, enriching themselves while providing limited services to constituents. Reform movements in investigative journalism, known as muckraking, exposed abuses and helped pave the way for later progressive reforms. The Gilded Age was therefore a time of stark contrasts: immense wealth and industrial power, alongside poverty and exploitation, technological progress and urban growth, alongside harsh labor conditions and social inequality, hope and opportunity for immigrants, alongside xenophobia and discrimination. It was an era that laid the foundation for modern American industry, cities, and labor movements, while also highlighting the urgent need for social reform and greater equality in an increasingly complex society. Progressive Era and Early 20th Century, 1890s, 1929. The turn of the 20th century ushered in the Progressive Era, a time of social, political, and economic reform aimed at addressing the challenges created by industrialization, urbanization, and corruption. Reformers sought to curb the power of monopolies, improve working conditions, and expand democratic participation, setting the stage for a modern, more equitable America. Theodore Roosevelt, rising to the presidency in 1901, became the face of progressive reform. He championed trust-busting, breaking up large corporate monopolies that exploited workers and consumers, and regulated industries such as railroads and meatpacking. Roosevelt also promoted conservation, establishing national parks, forests, and monuments, preserving vast areas of wilderness for future generations while balancing industrial growth with environmental stewardship. His leadership embodied the idea that the federal government could act as a force for fairness, public welfare, and national progress. Women's suffrage emerged as a defining social movement during this era. Activists like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Alice Paul tirelessly campaigned for women's right to vote, organizing marches, lobbying politicians, and enduring arrests. Their persistence culminated in the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, granting women nationwide the right to vote and reshaping American democracy. The suffrage movement also inspired broader debates about gender equality, education, and social reform. International events drew the United States onto the world stage. Although initially neutral, the country entered World War I in 1917 after repeated provocations, including unrestricted German submarine warfare. American troops, led by figures such as General John J. Pershing, played a crucial role in tipping the balance in favor of the Allies. Domestically, the war effort spurred economic mobilization, propaganda campaigns, and shifts in labor, with women and African Americans entering industries to fill workforce gaps. The war ended in 1918 with the armistice, and the Treaty of Versailles formally concluded the conflict, though debates over American involvement in global affairs continued. The post-war years brought the Roaring Twenties, a period of economic prosperity, technological innovation, and cultural change. Cities grew rapidly, fueled by mass production, automobiles, electricity, and consumer goods. Jazz music, speakeasies, and new fashions defined the era, reflecting both freedom and social experimentation. Yet the decade also exposed inequalities, with racial tensions, organized crime, and rural-urban divides highlighting the limits of prosperity for all Americans. This period of boom ended abruptly with the Great Depression, beginning in 1929 after the stock market crash. Banks failed, unemployment soared, and families faced poverty and hunger. Farmers struggled with falling crop prices, and industrial production collapsed. The economic crisis created widespread hardship, reshaping American society and politics and setting the stage for the transformative policies of the New Deal under President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The Progressive Era and early 20th century were therefore a time of reform, innovation, cultural change, and crisis. It was an era in which the United States grappled with the consequences of industrial growth, fought for social justice and equality, engaged in global conflict, and faced the vulnerabilities of an interconnected, modern economy. The lessons, achievements, and struggles of this period left a lasting imprint on American society, government, and culture. World War II, 1941 to 1945. World War II was the most devastating and transformative conflict in human history, involving dozens of nations across multiple continents. The United States, initially committed to neutrality, was drawn into the war after the surprise Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, which destroyed battleships, aircraft, and killed over 2,400 American service members. The attack unified the nation, ending isolationist sentiment almost overnight. President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared war on Japan, and soon after, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, plunging America fully into a two-front global conflict. In Europe, the United States joined the Allies, including Britain, the Soviet Union, and Free French forces, in the fight against Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. Early involvement focused on aiding Britain through Lend-Lease, supplying critical resources, and preparing U.S. troops for combat. American forces participated in the North African Campaign, 1942 to 1943, under generals such as Dwight D. Eisenhower, securing key ports and preparing for the invasion of Italy. The Italian campaign saw fierce fighting at battles like Monte Cassino, demonstrating the difficulty of mountainous warfare and the resilience of Axis defenses. The D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944, represented one of the largest amphibious military operations in history. Over 156,000 Allied troops landed on the beaches of Normandy, facing entrenched German fortifications, mines, and artillery fire. The success of D-Day marked a turning point in the war, opening a Western front that, combined with the Soviet advance from the east, would eventually liberate France and push German forces toward defeat. Simultaneously, the United States provided essential air support, logistics, and reinforcements, demonstrating industrial and military coordination on an unprecedented scale. In the Pacific theater, the U.S. confronted a tenacious Japanese military. The strategy of island hopping, seizing strategically important islands while bypassing heavily fortified ones, allowed the United States to approach Japan's home islands. Battles were intense and costly. Midway, 1942, halted Japanese expansion, while Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa tested American forces with brutal jungle warfare, kamikaze attacks, and entrenched defenses. Thousands of soldiers, sailors, and Marines perished, while the civilian populations on islands suffered immense hardship. The home front in the United States played a vital role in the war effort. Factories switched from consumer goods to military production, producing tanks, airplanes, ships, and munitions at record pace. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, symbolized by the cultural icon Rosie the Riveter, while rationing, war bonds, and civil defense campaigns mobilized the civilian population. The war also accelerated technological innovation, including radar, sonar, jet engines, and early computing. As the war drew to a close, the United States made a fateful decision to use atomic weapons to end the Pacific conflict. In August 1945, atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing tens of thousands instantly and forcing Japan to surrender. This ushered in the nuclear age, changing global politics and military strategy forever. By 1945, the human cost was staggering: over 400,000 American soldiers killed, millions wounded, and countless civilians across Europe and Asia perished. The Holocaust and other atrocities revealed the horrific consequences of Nazi ideology. Yet, the United States emerged from World War II as a global superpower, its economy strengthened by wartime production, its military unparalleled, and its political influence extending worldwide. The U.S. played a central role in establishing the United Nations, promoting international cooperation, and initiating the Marshall Plan, which rebuilt war-torn Europe. World War II fundamentally reshaped the United States. It transformed the nation into a global leader, accelerated social change, including opportunities for women and African Americans, and demonstrated the devastating power of modern technology in war. The courage, sacrifice, and innovation displayed both on the battlefield and the home front left a lasting legacy, shaping international relations, domestic policy, and American identity for generations to come. The Cold War, 1945 to 1991. After World War II, the global balance of power shifted dramatically, and the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as rival superpowers. Their ideological differences, capitalist democracy versus communist authoritarianism, sparked the Cold War, a conflict defined not by direct large-scale battles between the two nations, but by proxy wars, political maneuvering, technological competition, and the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. In the early years, Europe was divided. The city of Berlin became the focal point of tension when the Soviets blockaded West Berlin in 1948, aiming to cut off supplies and force the Allies out. In response, the Berlin airlift delivered food, fuel, and medicine to millions of residents via air for almost a year, demonstrating U.S. commitment to defending freedom and resisting Soviet expansion. The United States also became involved in hot conflicts to contain communism worldwide. In Korea, 1950 to 1953, North Korean forces, backed by China and the Soviet Union, invaded South Korea. U.S.-led United Nations forces intervened, leading to a bloody stalemate and an armistice that left Korea divided at the 38th parallel, a division that persists today. Later, the Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975, became one of the most controversial and divisive conflicts in U.S. history. American forces sought to prevent the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, but the guerrilla tactics of the Viet Cong, difficult terrain, and mounting domestic opposition led to a prolonged struggle that ended with U.S. withdrawal and the eventual reunification of Vietnam under communist control. The Cold War was not just fought on battlefields, it was a race for technological and scientific supremacy. The launch of Sputnik by the Soviet Union in 1957 spurred the space race, pushing the United States to invest heavily in science and education. This competition culminated in the historic Apollo 11 moon landing in 1969, when American astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin set foot on the lunar surface, marking a triumph of innovation and national pride. At home, the Cold War era coincided with major social movements. The civil rights movement challenged segregation and discrimination, with leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and Malcolm X pushing for justice through marches, boycotts, and legal battles. Landmark legislation, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, outlawed segregation and secured voting rights for African Americans, reshaping American society. Meanwhile, the women's rights movement fought for gender equality, reproductive rights, and workplace opportunities, while the environmental movement gained momentum, leading to legislation protecting air, water, and public lands. The Cold War also brought the world to the brink of nuclear catastrophe. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, when the Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, pitted President John F. Kennedy against Premier Nikita Khrushchev in a tense standoff that nearly led to global war. Through diplomacy, the crisis was resolved, illustrating both the dangers of the nuclear age and the importance of negotiation and international communication. By the late 1980s, a series of political and economic pressures weakened the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, combined with popular movements for democracy in Eastern Europe, paved the way for the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the eventual dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. The end of the Cold War marked the United States as the world's sole superpower and a leader in shaping the post-Cold War global order. The Cold War era was therefore a time of tension, innovation, social progress, and global competition. It defined international relations for nearly half a century, challenged Americans to confront issues of justice and equality at home, and pushed the nation to achieve technological and scientific feats that would inspire generations to come. America in the New Millennium, 1991, today. The end of the Cold War in 1991 marked a turning point for the United States. The nation emerged as the world's sole superpower, and with that position came new opportunities, responsibilities, and challenges. The 1990s were defined by the technology boom, fueled by the rise of the Internet, personal computing, and the rapid growth of companies in Silicon Valley, including Microsoft, Apple, Google, and Amazon. Email, cell phones, and early social media platforms revolutionized communication, commerce, and daily life, while stock market optimism created enormous wealth and new global economic connections. However, the optimism of the 1990s gave way to a new era of insecurity on September 11, 2001, when terrorist attacks by the extremist group Al-Qaeda struck the World Trade Center in New York City and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. Nearly 3,000 lives were lost, and the attacks shook the world. The United States responded with the War on Terror, initiating military operations in Afghanistan to dismantle Al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban from power. Later, the Iraq War, launched in 2003 under President George W. Bush, sought to eliminate Saddam Hussein's alleged weapons of mass destruction and topple his regime, though it became highly controversial due to prolonged conflict, insurgency, and civilian casualties. The 2000s also witnessed significant economic challenges. The 2008 financial crisis, caused by risky banking practices, subprime mortgage failures, and a global credit collapse, led to widespread foreclosures, unemployment, and economic instability. Major institutions like Lehman Brothers collapsed, and the federal government intervened with stimulus packages, bailouts, and reforms to stabilize the economy. This crisis exposed vulnerabilities in global finance and sparked debates on regulation, corporate responsibility, and economic inequality. Amid these challenges, the nation celebrated historic milestones in politics. In 2008, Barack Obama became the first African American president, a moment symbolizing decades of struggle for civil rights. His administration focused on healthcare reform, economic recovery after the financial crisis, foreign policy challenges, and efforts to address climate change. Obama's presidency inspired hope for social progress, increased political engagement among minority communities, and highlighted the ongoing importance of representation in American leadership. The 21st century also saw a surge in social movements advocating for justice, equality, and environmental protection. The LGBTQ+ rights movement achieved historic victories, including nationwide legalization of same-sex marriage in 2015. The Black Lives Matter movement, emerging after high-profile cases of police violence against African Americans, sparked protests across the nation and global awareness of systemic racial injustice. Climate activism gained momentum, driven by both grassroots organizers and young leaders like Greta Thunberg, demanding immediate action to combat global warming and protect natural resources. The COVID-19 pandemic, beginning in 2020, presented an unprecedented public health and economic crisis. Millions were infected, and hundreds of thousands lost their lives. The pandemic disrupted daily life, forced schools and workplaces to adapt to remote learning and telecommuting, and highlighted inequalities in healthcare access. Vaccination campaigns, scientific innovation, and public health measures became central to the national response, while Americans adapted to mask wearing, social distancing, and new norms for work, travel, and community engagement. Throughout these decades, the United States has confronted technological revolutions, terrorism, war, economic uncertainty, social movements, and global health crises. Each challenge tested the nation's resilience, unity, and values, while inspiring innovation, civic engagement, and reforms. From the internet boom to Barack Obama's historic presidency, from global conflicts to nationwide protests for justice, and from economic crises to public health emergencies, America in the new millennium continues to evolve, reflecting both the opportunities and responsibilities of a global superpower in an interconnected, complex world. The Future of America, ultra-detailed narration. As the United States continues into the 21st century, it stands as a nation shaped by its past but defined by its future possibilities. America's enduring identity is rooted in diversity, resilience, and innovation. Its population is increasingly multicultural, drawing strength from immigrants and communities around the globe. This demographic richness drives creativity, entrepreneurship, and cultural expression, visible in bustling cities, thriving tech hubs, artistic communities, and dynamic small towns across the nation. Environmental challenges and sustainability. One of the most pressing challenges for America is climate change. Rising temperatures, extreme weather events, wildfires in the west, hurricanes in the southeast, and rising sea levels threaten lives, infrastructure, and agriculture. Cities are investing in resilient infrastructure, green architecture, and renewable energy, while researchers develop solutions for carbon capture, sustainable transportation, and clean water systems. Nationwide, grassroots movements, environmental organizations, and policymakers collaborate to address climate risks, emphasizing the need for long-term planning and global cooperation. Technological innovation and the future economy. Technological advancement is reshaping every aspect of American life. Artificial intelligence, automation, robotics, biotechnology, renewable energy, and space exploration are creating new industries and transforming existing ones. Healthcare is being revolutionized with precision medicine and genetic engineering, transportation is evolving with electric and autonomous vehicles, and space initiatives, including private and government missions, offer new frontiers for exploration. However, these innovations bring complex ethical and societal questions, privacy concerns in a digital world, the displacement of jobs by automation, the equitable distribution of technology, and the environmental impact of rapid industrialization. America's leadership in innovation must therefore balance progress with responsibility, ensuring that benefits are widely shared and risks mitigated. Political challenges and civic engagement. Political polarization poses another critical challenge. Differences in ideology, policy priorities, and social values have intensified, making compromise more difficult and testing the strength of democratic institutions. Yet history shows that civic engagement, public dialogue, and grassroots activism are powerful tools for social change. Young Americans are increasingly involved in voting, advocacy, and community organizing, shaping national debates on healthcare, education, racial justice, and climate policy. Social progress and cultural transformation. Social movements continue to redefine American identity. LGBTQ+ rights, gender equality, racial justice, and indigenous rights remain central to national discourse. Organizations, protests, and legislative campaigns strive to achieve equity and inclusion, reflecting a society in constant evolution. Cultural innovation, through music, art, film, literature, and technology, amplifies diverse voices, shaping both national and global narratives. Global role and leadership. America's influence on the world stage continues to be profound. Its economy, diplomacy, military, and technological expertise position the nation as a key actor in global security, trade, and environmental initiatives. Challenges such as pandemics, cyber threats, terrorism, and geopolitical tensions demand continued leadership, collaboration, and strategic foresight. The vision of a resilient future. The United States story is far from finished. Its future will be determined by how it navigates environmental crises, technological revolutions, political divides, and social transformations. America's resilience lies in its people's creativity, courage, and commitment to core democratic ideals, liberty, justice, and opportunity. From pioneering renewable energy to exploring distant planets, from addressing systemic inequality to nurturing civic engagement, the nation's next chapters are being written today. The United States embodies a living experiment in democracy, continually adapting to new challenges while striving to uphold its founding principles. Its future promises innovation, diversity, and the enduring pursuit of a society where freedom, progress, and justice guide the path forward, a story that will continue to unfold for generations to come.